In the pulsing heart of New Haven, a city cloaked in the drab hues of an unyielding overcast sky, a sinister malaise had begun to weave its way through the cobblestone streets and towering skyscrapers. The air was thick with a clammy mist that clung to the skin and chilled the marrow, an eerie harbinger of the terrors that lurked unseen. As the relentless drizzle painted the cityscape with weeping streaks, the indifferent drone of traffic and city life played the soundtrack to a day that appeared ordinary, save for the hidden dread that was quietly tightening its grip. Dr. Alara Vincent, a woman whose appearance was as sharp and formidable as her intellect, navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the New Haven Disease Control Center with brisk efficiency. Her face, framed by sleek raven black hair that was always pulled back to reveal the stern lines of her jaw, was a mask of concentration. Her eyes, a steel gray, were perennially searching, fixated on puzzles and problems unseen to the layperson. She was the epitome of scientific poise, clad in a lab coat that was never less than immaculate, a stark contrast to the disarray of papers and samples that often festooned her workspace. The lab was her sanctum, a place of order and method, where the scent of antiseptic was a silent testament to the ceaseless war against contamination and chaos. The enigma that now lay before her was not one of mundane pathogens or common diseases. It was something far more baffling. It began as a mere whisper among medical circles, a series of peculiar cases that surfaced with disturbing symmetry. Each report detailed patients stricken with a bizarre array of neurological anomalies, their suffering inexplicable, their prognosis uncertain. The notes accumulated on Dr. Vincent's desk like fallen leaves, a testament to the growing unease that something unprecedented was afoot. But it was the latest case that sliced through her professional detachment like a scalpel. The patient, a man of no particular distinction other than the palpable aura of fear that seemed to radiate from him, had been admitted to the hospital in a state of abject horror, his hands clawing at his head, his voice hoarse with the conviction that something alien had invaded his skull. With a hand that was steady despite the maelstrom of her thoughts, Alara scanned the MRI images that flickered on the screen before her. There, amidst the ghostly white of the man's brain matter, coiled an anomaly that defied logic, a shadow that seemed to squirm with vile purpose, its form a grotesque mockery of nature. It was no mere tumor. This was a living entity, a parasite that had claimed the most sacred of sanctuaries, the human mind. While Alara's intellect churned with hypotheses and the potential dread of an epidemic, the populace of New Haven remained blissfully unaware of the burgeoning calamity. They traversed the sidewalks and filled the cafes, their laughter and chatter a comforting veil over the lurking silence of the unknown threat. But in the neglected alleyways where the city's illumination failed to reach, in the recesses of the forgotten subway tunnels, the shadows seemed to dance with malevolent glee. Something ancient and hungry had awakened in the heart of New Haven, its appetite whetted by the feast of minds it intended to consume. The days unfurled with the monotony of a city rhythm. The ebb and flow of New Haven's daily grind remained as consistent as the ticking of a clock. But beneath the surface of this urban ballet, a sinister parasite insidiously threaded its way through the unsuspecting populace. Each handshake, every crowded subway car, and the shared spaces of daily interactions became the quiet battlefields of an invisible assault. The city, unbeknownst to its denizens, was becoming a nursery to a nightmare. Amidst this brewing storm, Dr. Alara Vincent found an unlikely ally in Dr. Jacob Reed, an epidemiologist whose rough exterior and bristly mannerisms belied a razor-sharp mind and a relentless commitment to uncovering the truth. His appearance was as rugged as his demeanor, with a weathered face that spoke of years squinting into microscopes and against harsh sun on fieldwork. His salt and pepper beard gave him an almost scholarly air, if not for the intensity that smoldered in his eyes. Together, this unlikely duo embarked on a methodical hunt, their every step punctuated by the urgency of the outbreak's silent spread. Their journey took them away from the clinical sterility of the lab and into the heart of suburbia, to the doorstep of the initial victim's residence. It was an ordinary home, one lost among countless others in a cookie-cutter neighborhood where lawns were manicured with precision and life was measured by the routine of school runs and barbecues. Yet it was in this nondescript setting that the trail of the infection had its roots. The first victim, a man who once lived within these benign walls, had been the conduit for the parasite's entry into the human domain. As Alara and Jacob crossed the threshold, a palpable shift in atmosphere greeted them. The air within the house was stale, heavy with the echo of the chaos that had once unraveled in its confines. The home was a tableau of domestic life interrupted. Magazines still lay on the coffee table, layers of dust undisturbed on the family photos that adorned the mantelpiece, smiling faces frozen in time. Alara's scientific mind began piecing together the life of the first victim, trying to decipher the daily habits that might have led to his ill-fated encounter with the parasitic entity. Every item, every speck of dust, could hold the key to understanding the origin of the outbreak. Jacob, meanwhile, meticulously collected samples, swabbing surfaces, and bagging various household items that could potentially harbor the insidious worm. He moved with a quiet intensity, his thoughts lost in the potential ramifications of their findings. Each room provided them with fragments of the broader puzzle, from the kitchen where meals were prepared, to the bedroom where the victim had likely first succumbed to the horrific realization that something was terribly wrong. The team's investigation within the walls of this unremarkable house was just the beginning. It was the nexus from which they would trace the malignant thread back through the tapestry of New Haven's populace, unraveling the narrative of how this affliction came to be. As they left the suburban home, the weight of their task loomed large. They were pitted against an adversary that was as enigmatic as it was deadly, and time was a luxury they could not afford. The life cycle of the parasite, a helminth that should have been relegated to the annals of biological anomalies, not the bustling urban sprawl of New Haven, became clearer with each passing day. It was a devious entity, a master of manipulation that invaded the human host, burying itself within the brain, where it could hijack the very essence of its host's being. Through a combination of dogged investigation and dreadful realizations, Alara and Jacob pieced together the horror that had infiltrated the city. The parasite, it seemed, was introduced into the human body through an innocuous encounter, a chance ingestion of its microscopic eggs that lay dormant until they found their way to the brain. There they hatched and matured, slowly coiling through the cerebral tissue, feeding on the rich supply of blood and nutrients, and gradually exerting their malevolent influence over their host. The organism's spread was alarmingly simple yet effective. Close contact was its vehicle, turning every handshake, every hug, and every shared surface into a potential transmission event. As the truth unraveled, so too did the fabric of trust that bound the community of New Haven. The once friendly smiles of neighbors transformed into wary, calculating gazes. The mundane act of touching a door handle or pressing an elevator button became a source of dread. Public spaces emptied as the fear of contamination outweighed the desire for social interaction. The bustling city streets grew quiet, the vibrant life of the community retreating behind closed doors. Paranoia sank its claws deep into the city's psyche. Every cough was met with sidelong glances, every sneeze a cause for alarm. People began to avoid one another, the invisible threads of society unraveling one by one. Parents kept their children home from school, offices implemented work-from-home policies, and the local news churned out story after story on how to avoid the New Haven neurological parasite, as it had been dubbed. Alara and Jacob watched as the city they were striving to save succumbed to the insidious grip of fear. They worked tirelessly, the lab becoming both their battlefield and sanctuary. Alara's face, normally composed, began to show the strain of sleepless nights and relentless research, her angular features drawn and pale under the fluorescent lights. Jacob's focus never wavered, but his gruff demeanor was edged with urgency, the results of their tests only adding fuel to the fire of their mission. As the city spiraled into hysteria, Alara and Jacob delved deeper into the science, seeking a weakness, a chink in the parasite's armor. They knew that understanding the life cycle of the parasite was the key to halting its advance. Every discovery they made about its reproductive process, its gestation and spread, brought them closer to finding a solution. But with each revelation, the true horror of the parasite's capabilities became more apparent, a testament to nature's terrifying ingenuity and a stark reminder of human vulnerability amidst the unseen natural world. The city of New Haven, once teeming with the vibrant hustle of daily life, had come to a jarring halt. The quarantine, a desperate measure to contain the parasitic threat, cast a palpable shroud over the streets. Businesses shuttered, schools closed, the once buzzing din of traffic reduced to the occasional murmur of an emergency vehicle cutting through the silence. In this eerie stillness, Alara and Jacob found themselves in a race against time. The isolation imposed by the quarantine, while necessary, only served to heighten the collective sense of dread that now pervaded the city. Families huddled within their homes, the glow of television screens flickering against curtained windows as they sought updates on the crisis unfolding around them. Some of New Haven's residents were unwitting hosts to the parasitic menace, their bodies hijacked, their actions no longer entirely their own. In these victims, the parasite worked insidiously, weaving itself into the fabric of their brains, nudging neurons to fire abnormally, twisting thoughts, amplifying fears, or dulling emotions to keep its presence undetected. Inside the disease control center, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of determination and apprehension. Alara's lab, once a beacon of order, now resembled a storm's eye, with paper strewn about, whiteboards filled with scribbled equations and biological diagrams, and computers constantly running simulations. The sterile smell of the lab was now mixed with the faint odor of stale coffee and the indefinable scent that accompanies sustained human exertion. Jacob, his gruff exterior belied by the lines of concern etching his forehead, pored over the latest data with Alara. They were piecing together the enigma of the parasite's transmission, trying to identify patterns and potential weaknesses. Each new piece of data was a double-edged sword, offering both hope and a deeper realization of the challenge they faced. The city's anxiety was almost tangible, a living thing that slithered through the undercurrents of the empty streets and tapped against the windows of the quarantined citizens. In their isolation, people began to turn inward, questioning every slight headache, every moment of forgetfulness, every strange dream, if the parasite was gnawing at the edges of their minds. Meanwhile, Alara and Jacob worked tirelessly, sustained by a sense of duty that eclipsed their own fears. The lab was both their sanctuary and their war room, filled with the constant hum of machinery and the palpable heartbeat of urgency. With each test, each hypothesis, they inched closer to a breakthrough, aware that outside the fortified walls of their scientific bastion, an insidious enemy was breeding within the minds of the populace, threatening to unravel the very fabric of their community. As the days wore on under the grim pall of the quarantine, the infrastructure of New Haven started to buckle under the strain. The city, a complex organism reliant on the smooth functioning of its many systems, began to show signs of distress. Garbage collection trucks sat idle, their usual routes disrupted. Streetlights blinked erratically, no longer a reliable guide through the city's arteries. Even the internet, that digital lifeline connecting the quarantined citizens to the outside world, became sluggish, its bandwidth strained by the constant demand. The creeping realization that the parasitic infection had infiltrated the ranks of the city's leadership sent ripples of panic through the community. City officials, police officers, doctors, positions held by people who were supposed to protect and serve the public, were now potential carriers of the terrifying entity. The very pillars that supported the societal structure of New Haven were crumbling. Alara witnessed the chaos unfold from the relative isolation of her lab. Screens flickered with scenes of disorder as emergency services were overwhelmed by calls from frantic citizens. Each report of another official showing symptoms was a gut punch, a chilling reminder that the parasite respected no title, no position of authority. She could feel the tendrils of panic trying to take root in her own psyche, a whispering voice suggesting that Jacob, her confidant and co-conspirator in this scientific siege, could be compromised. She pushed these thoughts down, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Trust was a luxury she could not afford to lose, not yet. Alara's composure was an armor forged in the flames of her unwavering dedication to science and her role as a guardian of public health. Yet even armor can develop chinks, and the constant pressure was a hammer relentlessly tapping at her resolve. The symptoms of those infected were becoming more pronounced, more disturbing. A city council member found wandering the streets, his eyes glazed over, mumbling incoherent statistics about the city's budget. A police sergeant, once a paragon of calm under pressure, barricaded in her office, her radio calls a jumble of paranoid warnings and cries for help. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of human life and activity, was now a tableau of dystopian dysfunction. The silence of the streets was broken only by the occasional siren, the sound seemingly more forlorn each time it echoed off the empty buildings. Power outages began to occur with alarming frequency, plunging neighborhoods into darkness and igniting flares of fear among the populace. In her lab, surrounded by the hum of equipment and the blue glow of computer screens, Alara worked with dogged persistence. Every test run, every sample analyzed was a step toward understanding the enemy within their midst. But with the city's infrastructure failing and chaos nipping at the edges of society's carefully constructed order, she knew that time was a luxury they might no longer have. The grim revelation hit Dr. Alara Vincent like a physical blow, leaving her mind reeling as she stared at the data that sprawled across her screens. The parasite, which had infiltrated the city of New Haven with such insidious ease, wasn't just a mindless predator. It was cunning, sentient, and worst of all, collective. Each host it claimed didn't simply fall into sickness. They became part of a larger, more terrifying whole. The infected were not lost in delirium. They were absorbed into a hive mind, their actions seemingly coordinated by a central will. New Haven was no longer just a city under siege by a disease. It was a chessboard, and the uninfected were pawns clinging desperately to their autonomy. The streets, once pathways connecting lives and stories, had become the veins through which this new intelligence pulsed. It was using the city's infrastructure against its very inhabitants, turning the systems meant to support life into conduits for its own expansion. One evening, in the sterile blue light of the laboratory, Alara witnessed a transformation that turned her blood to ice. Jacob Reed, her colleague, who had stood by her side from the beginning, began to exhibit the telltale signs of infection. His precise, methodical nature gave way to odd behaviors. He'd pause mid-sentence, his gaze unfocused, as if listening to an inaudible command. His movements, once defined by a graceful efficiency, became jerky, erratic, as though he were struggling against invisible restraints. Then came the heart-stopping moment when his transformation became undeniable. Jacob stood rigid, his eyes a mirror of the vacancy that marked the others. When he spoke, his voice was not his own. It was as if the words were formed by something speaking through him, a collective voice that was cold, calculating, and utterly alien. The loss of her friend and ally to the parasite's insidious influence was a blow that sent waves of despair crashing over Alara. Her fear metastasized into something palpable, a living thing that whispered of defeat and surrender. The reality that anyone, even she, could fall prey to the parasite's control became a specter that haunted her every moment. But within Alara, a spark of defiance flickered to life amidst the encroaching darkness. Her fear, rather than paralyzing her, became fuel for her resolve. She could not let New Haven fall to this entity. She could not allow humanity to become a footnote in the history of a parasite's conquest. The laboratory, once a sanctuary of order and logic, had become a bunker, the last stand in a city where the lines between friend and foe were irrevocably blurred. Every uninfected person was a potential ally, every controlled individual a possible enemy. Trust was a gamble with unfathomable stakes. Alara poured herself into her research with renewed urgency. If there was a way to sever the connection between the parasite and its hive, to free the individuals it had claimed, she would find it. The city of New Haven depended on it. Humanity depended on it. The battle for control was no longer just about the survival of the body, but the preservation of the self. and Alara Vincent was not ready to concede either. The intervention of the military brought with it a brief, hopeful respite, a belief that order might be restored in the chaos-stricken city of New Haven. Dr. Alara Vincent watched from the barricaded windows of her lab as convoys of armed vehicles rolled into the streets, soldiers moving in disciplined lines, their faces set in determined grimness. They came equipped with the might of the military's arsenal, but they were ill-prepared for an adversary that could not be discerned by the muzzle of a gun or the sight of a drone. The parasite had woven itself into the fabric of the city's populace, hidden behind the most benign and familiar of visages, the young and the old, the bold and the meek, making allies indistinguishable from threats. Alara and her remaining uninfected colleague, Dr. Jacob Reed, now teetering on the edge of being completely subsumed by the parasite's will, experienced firsthand the horror of this new warfare. They watched through surveillance feeds as a group of soldiers provided aid to civilians, unaware that among those they were helping, the parasite was looking back at them through human eyes. It waited, with predatory patience, until the opportune moment to strike. An old woman, her face creased with what seemed like years of worry, suddenly convulsed in the arms of a young medic, her mouth stretching into an unnaturally wide grin as black tendrils sprouted from her skin, lashing out with a life of their own. Jacob, pale and sweating with the effort it took to maintain his own consciousness, turned away from the screens, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's learning, adapting. We're not just fighting a disease, we're fighting something that's using us as pawns." The military's tactics, built for combat with a visible enemy, crumbled in the face of this inscrutable threat. Soldiers were ambushed by the very civilians they were sent to protect, supply lines disrupted by individuals who retained all semblance of humanity until their horrific transformation was triggered. No perimeter was secure, no stronghold was impregnable. This enemy did not need to storm barricades or breach fortifications. It passed through checkpoints with a smile and a wave, wearing the friendly face of a neighbor, a sister, a father. And by the time its true nature was revealed, it was often too late. The horror was not just in the transformation, but in the realization that the enemy could be the person you just shared a meal with, the one you gave orders to, or the one who slept in the bunk beside you. In the lab, surrounded by her research and the dwindling hope of finding a solution, Alara's resolve hardened. The military, for all its strength, could not differentiate friend from foe, but perhaps science could. She began to work on a test, something that could detect the presence of the parasite before it revealed itself, a way to see past the masquerade that had cost so many lives. As the military struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare, Alara knew that the real battle would not be won with bullets and bloodshed, but with knowledge and understanding. The enemy was within, and it was a race against time to discover the key to unlocking the parasite's hold on the city. The grim revelation unfolded within the sterile walls of a clandestine government laboratory, tucked away in the underbelly of New Haven. Dr. Alara Vincent and Dr. Jacob Reed stood amidst the disarray of abandoned experiments, their faces illuminated by the flickering lights that cast long, unsettling shadows across the room. The shelves were cluttered with petri dishes, vials, and notebooks filled with hurried, cryptic notations. Alara, her gaze sharp and critical, examined the documents strewn across the lab desks. She pieced together the narrative of a secret biological program gone horribly awry, a forbidden foray into warfare that sought to control and weaponize a parasitic organism. Her hands trembled, not from the cold that pervaded the room, but from the realization of the depth of human folly they had uncovered. Jacob, his condition worsening yet fighting the parasite's influence with every shred of willpower, looked over her shoulder, his brow furrowed with concern. "They played God," he muttered, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. "And now we're paying the price for their hubris." The moral implications of the discovery were as monstrous as the parasitic entity they were battling. There was a palpable sense of betrayal, knowing that fellow humans had engineered this biological nightmare. Alara felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders, not only to find a cure, but to expose the truth and ensure that such reckless tampering with nature was never repeated. Their search for answers took them through the remnants of the lab, where they found a vial labeled with a code that corresponded to the parasitic organism. It lay in a containment unit, cracked open and empty, a silent testament to the catastrophe that had unfolded from its contents. The records indicated a series of experiments intended to create an organism that could infiltrate and sabotage enemy ranks without a single shot fired. Instead, the parasite proved to be uncontrollable, its ability to manipulate and dominate its host far exceeding any of the parameters the scientists had dared to anticipate. As they delved deeper into the data, Alara and Jacob unearthed a potential weakness in the parasite's life cycle, a brief stage where it was vulnerable. With this sliver of hope, they retreated to their own lab, the weight of time pressing against them. Alara worked tirelessly, fueled by the urgency of their discovery and the knowledge that each moment wasted could mean another mind lost to the parasite's influence. Jacob, though weak, provided insight from his own harrowing experience, offering suggestions that only someone who had been on the brink of losing themselves could conceive. Together, they stood at the precipice of a breakthrough, battling not just for the survival of the city, but for the redemption of humanity's missteps. They raced to synthesize a cure, aware that outside the lab walls, the city was teetering on the edge of total collapse, the very fabric of society being unraveled by an invisible foe birthed from human arrogance. The descent into violence within the confines of New Haven escalated with terrifying swiftness. Streets once bustling with the vibrant hum of city life now echoed with the screams of the afflicted and the chaos of a society unraveling at the seams. The infection, cunning and insidious, had woven itself into the fabric of the community, an invisible thread pulling tighter and tighter until the entire tapestry threatened to come apart. Inside the laboratory, the air was thick with tension and the acrid scent of chemicals. Dr. Alara Vincent and Dr. Jacob Reed, their faces drawn and pale from sleepless nights, hunched over a microscope. The slide beneath the lens held a potential savior, a compound that had shown promise in disrupting the parasite's life cycle. Alara's hands were steady as she made minute adjustments to the microscope, her eyes searching for the telltale signs of the compound's efficacy. Jacob watched on, his thoughts a tangled mess. The parasite within him was a ticking time bomb, its presence a constant reminder of the stakes they were playing for. He knew better than anyone the price of failure. They had managed to distill the essence of their research into a single vial of clear liquid, the potential cure. It was an anti-parasitic agent, designed to target the organism without harming the host. In theory, it was their best shot. In practice, they had yet to understand its full implications. The compound was not without its risks. It had to be administered during a specific phase of the parasite's development to be effective, and even then, there was no guarantee. Timing was everything, and the window of opportunity was small. But time was a luxury they no longer had. Outside the safety of the lab, the military had set up blockades, attempting to contain the spread, but with each passing hour, the infection claimed more victims, and the lines between the healthy and the infected blurred dangerously. Alara and Jacob were acutely aware of the terrible decision before them. They had the means to potentially save those infected, to restore them to who they once were. But the logistics of distributing the cure were daunting. The city was large, the infection widespread, and the cure limited. Who would receive it? How would they decide? The alternative was a stark, cold solution, a means to eradicate the infection in a more final manner. A conversation had been held in hushed tones with the military leaders, the option of releasing a counteragent into the city's water or air supply, one that would not discriminate between infected and non-infected. It was a last resort, one that carried the heavy burden of sacrificing innocent lives to save a greater number. As they stood on the precipice of an impossible choice, the weight of their decision bore down upon them. Save a few and watch the city tear itself apart, or play God and condemn the innocent to save the many. Alara's mind raced with the ethical implications, her heart heavy. She had become a doctor to save lives, not to make choices about who deserved to live. And yet, this was the reality they faced. A reality where the lines of morality were as blurred as those separating the sick from the well. In the end, they chose a third path, a sliver of hope in the darkness. They would fight to distribute the cure while working with the military to prepare the counteragent, ready to deploy it only if all other options failed. It was a race against time, with the city as the finish line, and the fate of thousands hanging in the balance. The streets of New Haven became a battleground for the cure, each success and failure etched into the faces of Alara and Jacob as they fought to reclaim the city from the grip of an unseen enemy. With each life saved, hope was rekindled, but with each setback, the shadow of the final terrible choice loomed ever closer. In the wake of the biological storm that had swept through New Haven, the city lay quiet, as if holding its breath. The once thriving metropolis was now a patchwork of abandoned streets and homes, marked by the signs of a hasty exodus. Here and there, life began to stir, tentative and wary. The survivors emerged, their eyes hollow from what they had witnessed, their spirits bruised by the losses they had suffered. The cure, a beacon of hard-won hope, was administered with solemn gravity. Lines of people, their faces etched with the memories of recent horrors, waited for their turn. Alara Vincent oversaw the process, her brow furrowed in concentration. Each successful treatment was a small victory, in a war that had seemed unwinnable, yet the relief she should have felt was tempered by a gnawing anxiety. Beside her, Dr. Jacob Reed monitored the recovering patients, his demeanor that of a man walking on a tightrope. The gruff exterior he usually displayed had been worn away, revealing a vulnerability he would have previously kept hidden. Together, they had weathered the storm, their partnership forged in the fire of shared trials. Yet, even as they administered the last of the cure, a silent question hung between them. Was it truly over? The city itself bore the physical and psychological scars of the epidemic. Buildings stood empty, their windows staring like vacant eyes, graffiti-covered walls where desperate messages had been scrawled during the height of the panic. "Don't trust anyone," one message read, a chilling reminder of the paranoia that had gripped the city. In the aftermath, Alara and Jacob faced the task of not just rebuilding a city, but the trust of its people. Neighbors who had once shared meals now regarded each other with suspicion. Friends had turned against friends. And while the physical presence of the parasite had been eradicated, the seed of doubt it planted continued to flourish in the darkest corners of people's minds. Though they tried to move forward, Alara and Jacob were haunted by the knowledge that the parasite had not been destroyed completely. It lay dormant, contained within the walls of the very laboratory that had sought to end its existence. They were custodians of a malevolent force, one they hoped would never again see the light of day. Then, as life stumbled towards a new semblance of normality, a chilling discovery was made. A routine checkup in a town beyond the quarantine zone revealed an anomaly. A young girl with no apparent connection to New Haven presented symptoms that sent a ripple of cold fear through the medical team. An MRI scan showed the unmistakable signature of the parasite nestled within her brain. The news reached Alara and Jacob just as they were beginning to dare hope. The implications were clear and immediate. The quarantine had been breached. The organism had found a new host, a silent stowaway that had slipped through their defenses. The battle, it seemed, was not over. The realization that their enemy was far more cunning and resilient than they had believed shook them to their core. Somewhere along the line, they had missed something: a carrier, a mutation, a hidden path of transmission. The city of New Haven might have been saved, but the threat persisted, insidious and invisible. As the report of the new case closed, Alara's hand found Jacob's, their grip a wordless pact. They would go back to the drawing board, back to the front lines. The story of New Haven was a warning, a tale of science's reach and nature's defiance. And they, its reluctant chroniclers, would continue the fight, wherever it might lead them next.